Welcome to the GAB by the Independent Press Award. I'm your hostess, Gabby Olzak. Today we welcome Stephen P. Fish, author of A Call to Reform, winner of the 2021 New York City Big Book Award. Steve, a Pennsylvania native, has a master's in public administration from Penn State. For his professional life, Steve has worked extensively in the insurance industry. He's a certified administrative manager, and most recently taught high school economics and AP European history and global issues. A Call to Reform is Steve's debut book. Congratulations, Steve, and welcome to the GAB.
Thank you, Gabby. Very pleased to be here, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you. So my daughter is an AP history student, and we are a bunch of history buffs in our family. I'm sure A Call to Reform will inspire many discussions around the dinner table. And I want to thank you, Steve, because A Call to Reform really reminded me of what it means to be an American and just how fortunate we are. How would you summarize A Call to Reform for our readers and listeners?
Well, A Call to Reform was written after I retired and right when the pandemic started. I was a little concerned with the way things were going in the country, and I was a little frustrated. And I had a great friend in California. His name's Ken Salazar, and he would call me every Saturday morning, and we would talk about reform ideas. And that's really how it started. He encouraged me to write a book. And of course, I love history. I taught the last 18 years of my working career at Cumberland Valley High School in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And so I just kind of started writing these reform ideas up and so on.
How was your 18 years as a secondary education teacher a driving force in your decision to write the book? What inspired you?
Well, my students inspired me because, so many people talk about how, things are terrible today and whatever. And I just, in the schools, I just had the complete opposite reaction. I just loved it. And I thought that the young people today are extremely intelligent, much more probably than I was when I went to high school.
I agree.
In the last century.
Yes, definitely. I learned a long time ago that I am not smarter than an 11th grader for sure. You brought up something before, the pandemic. So we're living in very unusual times. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and most recently, Roe versus Wade being overturned, possibly being overturned. How does that emphasize the importance of reform?
Well, part of the book, actually, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to make it short. I was in the barber shop one day and was talking to a man that was cutting my hair who grew up in Italy. And he would tell me stories about fascist Italy. And he actually came to my AP European class a couple times, and the kids just loved him, literally loved him. And we were talking about these reform ideas and the important human rights and civil liberties that we have in our American culture. And just like that, the young lady turned around who was cutting hair in the next barber place or whatever, and barber chair. And she said, kids today, they just don't know what they have here in America. I said, they're really lucky to be here. And just like that, the light bulb went off in my head. And I realized that I was going to make the book a little bit about a history of how the founding fathers chose these important human rights and civil liberties, and then also lead into these, in the second part of the book, lead into the reform ideas. So it's very timely. Actually, the book's very timely because my fear was that someday a strong man or a political party would start taking away our rights and civil liberties that we all have come to enjoy. And sure enough, you turn the TV on today and they're talking about overturning Roe versus Wade. And I grew up at a time when they didn't have, when abortion wasn't legal and Planned Parenthood. And I kind of look at it as one of those rights that are not written into the Constitution, but nevertheless, it's a right. And if we lose that right, I think that would be the first time in 230 years that an actual human right has been taken away from American citizens. And that's not good. That's
No,
just,
it's not good. And it's really frightening, actually. And you did point out many instances globally where this has occurred. Of course, the most prominent one would be Nazi Germany. That you did speak about that in your book. In part two, you laid out so many interesting reform ideas for a number of civil liberties: healthcare, education, climate control, just to name a few. Steve, how did you decide on which topics to include in the book?
well, that was based on those discussions that Ken and I would have each week. And, a lot of them and some of those I taught in my global issues course, which was the last one that I taught at Cumberland Valley, the last 5 to 6 years that I was there. So that's kind of how all that evolved.
What civil liberties are you most passionate about reforming, and why?
Well, in particular, when Jefferson wrote, he took life, liberty, and property, which is what Locke said. And when he wrote that, he changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, some of these human rights and civil liberties are important to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For example, in the First Amendment, you get the religious freedom and toleration, and that's a big one today too, when you think about it. You also have the freedom of speech in the First Amendment. You have freedom of the press, and you have freedom of assembly. Going back to freedom of the press, lately it's come out that the past administration wanted to literally shoot the protesters in the street last June or whatever, or a couple Junes ago. And of course, they have every right to peacefully protest and so forth. You also have the right to a speedy trial. What I discovered in my research was that people were being held, particularly at Rikers Island prison in New York, which I didn't even know existed until I started doing some of the research. They were held there for years and never were given a trial. And again, that's right in the Constitution, in the Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. So another one is the idea and the punishment should fit the crime. And again, in my research, I discovered that time and time again throughout the United States, there were local jurisdictions that were imposing really harsh crimes on, really harsh punishments on crimes, and they didn't fit. There was one case where they wanted to take in Indiana, I believe, a man's car, which was worth $40,000. And all he did was steal a pack of cigarettes from a grocery store.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of things like that that are very kind of quietly and subtly happening, and people don't realize. And that's really cutting into those human rights and civil liberties that we all have come to enjoy and we live by. That's part of our unique American culture.
So, Steve, you quoted in the book as saying, "Let us come together to reform the national government in the hopes of preserving the positive aspects of America's unique culture." So often when one hears the word reform, it seems like it could sound like a radical change, but I gather that you're not saying that. What is your idea of reform, and what does it mean?
Well, to me, reform goes back to the original founding fathers, where they put in a type of government that allows us, the American citizens, to make changes each generation in a non-violent way by passing bills, and we can add amendments to the Constitution and all kinds of things. So I kind of consider myself a middle of the road person. I try not to be on the radical left or the radical right. In fact, when I was in school, I re-registered as an independent so that I couldn't influence kids one way or another, because I just didn't think that was right. But when you think about reform, like let's take, for example, these are things that people have asked for in some case 30 years. And we haven't been able to get this pushed through because of things like the filibuster and whatever. A good case in point is term limits for senators and House of Representatives. It used to be that people would be elected when of course the Constitution first started, and they would come there. They weren't even paid. They would do the business of the country, and then they would go back home. But the perks now that those representatives and senators have is just incredible. And the thing is, though, people have a right to change the Constitution, and they can do so, but they have to believe in that. You can't vote as a tribe all the time. You have to, like they say, 60-some% of the people believe in term limits. Okay. So, don't elect, I don't care whether it's a Democrat or Republican, but don't elect somebody that's not for that, because you'll never get it changed if that's the case. And there's all kinds of things like that, Gabby. It's just incredible, the things that could be done to reform the modern government and make it more efficient to people. Healthcare. You talked about healthcare earlier. Do you know that most people out there think we have the greatest healthcare in the world? Well, I hate to tell you, when I was teaching, I discovered we're like ranked 19th in the world.
Wow.
We do not have the greatest healthcare in the world. And we can change that. And by the way, we're the only industrial nation in the entire globe that doesn't have a basic healthcare program for all its citizens.
So you talk about how we can change it. How can readers become part of the discussion and play a role in the reform? How do they become active?
I'm glad you asked that. We have a website. It's at www.acalltoreform, and we're just kind of getting it up and started. And actually, it's been there about a year. But we're hoping that we can get people to go there and read about our reform ideas and make comments, and maybe even eventually we'll have a registry. And we'd like to get enough people that eventually somebody in each state would kind of take the lead and go in and give a copy of our book to the senators and representatives, in the hopes that we can get something done. By the way, on that website, eventually we're going to rank the things that are important. I think, making it easier to vote is probably up there at the top, because everything flows from that. But then you have term limits and all kinds of stuff.
So many issues, as you said. So just tell us, Steve, why then do you think A Call to Reform is an important read? And how do you hope it will impact readers' lives?
Well, thank you for that question. That's a great question. I hope it helps people to better understand what it means to be an American, because if that happens, I hope they will begin to engage politically, meaning talk to each other, because people don't like to talk about politics anymore, even at family affairs and whatever. But if they begin to engage politically again, perhaps we can get this effort going to modernize the federal government, and most importantly, protect and preserve our unique American culture with its human rights and civil liberties. And we can do this for future generations. That's what it was all about. We started this movement to try to preserve those civil liberties and human rights, and maybe even add a few, because there's things that, women are not treated equally in this country. There's no question about that. And they should be treated equally, and things like that.
It's been a long fight, for sure. And I urge readers and listeners to pick up A Call to Reform, because it's an education and it's an eye opener. So Steve, this is your first book. What was the writing, publishing process like for you?
Oh, I'm still learning. I thought I retired. I was going to just have a great life and retire and do whatever I wanted, but it's like learning a whole job over again. As a retired teacher, I didn't have, tons of money, and publishers in the beginning said, "Well, what's your budget?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. I've never written a book before." So they said, "Well, unless you have 20 or 30,000, we can't help you." Well, as a retired teacher, I didn't have 20 or $30,000. So I put together, Ken and I actually put together a group of people. In fact, the book is actually set up for publication in California. And there was a lady in California that Ken knew that looked through it for grammar. And then I found a man that I worked with here at Cumberland Valley who was outstanding. And he was a grammar teacher, and they called him the mean green or the mean lean grading machine. So he went through it again too. So basically we put together a group of people. We were able to get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And now we're trying to find maybe a publisher or somebody who would help with marketing or a printer so that we can get hard copies made and maybe get them into bookstores.
Bookstores and even quite possibly into schools. That's an avenue, and libraries that you should look into. So
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom for aspiring authors?
Yeah, don't give up. Just kind of pursue it, write your thing. Everything will fall into place. It might take years. Like in my case, I'm still looking for people to help with marketing and how to get it in. And you're exactly right. I've had umpteen people tell me after they read the book, oh, this would be great in a junior high or a early senior high class, civil problems of democracy, where they could talk about these ideas and things. But you have to be able to know how to do that, to get it into schools and also get it into bookstores and things. And I'm still learning with that.
It is a process. So Steve, what's next for you? Do you have plans for another book?
That's a possibility. As soon as I can get the marketing worked out on this one, there are some reform ideas that were not in the original book, like this filibuster thing that comes up time and time again. It's almost like it's the old, instead of the tyranny of the minority, which was a phrase that was bandied about in the 1800s before the Civil War, it's now like tyranny of the majority. The majority can't, the country's so polarized that it's almost impossible to get 60 senators to vote for anything, because as long as that filibuster is in place, we can't even get basic things done. Which brings me back to history. In Poland, one of the reasons that the country disintegrated before World War I, and then it did come back eventually, but in their legislature, they had to have unanimous approval to get anything done. Imagine that.
Yeah, imagine that.
They never got anything done. And the filibuster's not quite as bad, but it's causing almost the same problems here. So well, Steve, I may write another book.
Well, you certainly have an awful lot to say, and we would love to hear some more. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. This is Gabby Olzak of the GAB. Join us next week when we talk with Liz Bensley, author of The Glimpse. Until next time, keep reading.
Thank you very much, Gabby.